Guten Abend, Frau Amesberger, Frau Halbmayr und
Evening, Ms. Amesberger, Ms. Halbmayr, Mr. Simon, and also to our audience. Really warm welcome to the presentation of the book My Mom Was a Resistance Fighter, and which was published in 2019 in the editorial publisher house Picos Verlag. And this is in the context of the events of the 76th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp of Ravensbrück. Briefly about what we're going to do tonight. I will present you the authors in a second. Then the authors will give us a talk about their research results, about 20 minutes. And then afterwards, for you as our audience, you have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the comment function on YouTube if you're registered, or you can use the application Slido, which is linked in YouTube. I will give you further instructions later on. So, our speakers tonight, there's Helga Amesberger. She's been studying ethnology and sociology at the University in Vienna and made a doctorate thesis in political science. As a scientific assistant, she's in the Vienna Institute for Conflict Research, as well as in the university context. Her main research fields is prostitution policies, National Socialism and Holocaust, violence against women, racism, and feminist research. And in this field, she had quite a lot of publications. Simon Clemens, he studied in Bonn political science, sociology, and currently he's studying his master in sociology European societies at the Freie Universität Berlin. He is a fellow of the research network SED Stadt in the Freie Universität Berlin, and he's also working at the Humboldt University in the context of theory of politics, and he's working freelance for the Federal Agency of Political Education. Then we have Brigitte Halbmayr. She also studied in Vienna, sociology and political sciences, and made a doctorate thesis there. She's a scientific assistant also at the Institute for Conflict Research. And she is also teaching assignments. Her main research focal points are racism, right-wing extremism, integration, gender studies, National Socialism, Holocaust, oral history, and biography research. Let me add that, as well as Helga Amesberger as Brigitte Halbmayr, are members of the Austrian camp community Ravensbrück, and they're dealing for a long time already with the biographies of former deportees to Ravensbrück. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, they will present two further books about the persecution of women as the so-called as-socials during National Socialism, also here in the context of our program. And with that, we're going to start the presentation of the authors of their book.
Herzlich willkommen und vielen
Welcome, and thank you for your interest to our book, Meine Mama, Widerstandskämpferin. My Mom Was a Resistance Fighter, which was published in 2019 in Picos Verlag in Vienna. I'll show you the book in a second. In terms of this publication, we did this thanks to a subvention of the city of Vienna in the context of democracy in Vienna, 100 years of presence, history, and future. For Brigitte and me, we've been working for more than 20 years on the topic of Austrian women in the concentration camp of Ravensbrück, especially about the contribution of the former resistance fighters. This seemed particularly important to us because in the general conscience, but also in the research about resistance is mainly thought from the male perspective, and the presentation usually follows the gender stereotypes. So there are some kind of perception biases, for example, to state that mainly men would have been in leading positions, and that women basically were only assisting to the resistance activities. The subtitle of our book, Networks of the Resistance and Their Significance for the Next Generation, already shows the other central topics. Next to the analysis of 3 resistance networks, we're asking a question about the consequences of these experiences of resistance and persecutions on 2 levels. On one side, we're asking for the direct consequences of these experiences of resistance and deportation for the women themselves after 1945, and we're highlighting certain aspects as health, family life, with a special attention to their political activities after 1945 and their attitude towards democracy in general. And on the other hand, we're also touching the next generation in interviews in a group discussion with children of resistance fighters. We followed the questions if the resistance activities of the mothers had been also transferred within the family to the next generation, and also the question up to which point the political socialization was for them and which kind of influence the history of the mothers had on their own political way of thinking. So in the following 15 minutes, we will give some aspects about the resistance of the women during National Socialism and their contribution to the democratization of Austria. But first of all, Brigitte will present the 3 protagonists of our book and their resistance networks. So the first of the 3 women we are portraying is Hansi Albensteiner. She was called Hansi. She was born in 1917 in Vienna and belonged to the Kreis 7 of the so-called KJV in Vienna. The second of our protagonists is Irma Trixak, also born in 1917. Probably some of you have met her personally, and she was active in the group of the Communist Czech movement. There was a group of young people who belonged to the Czechoslovakian minority in Vienna. And the third woman is Gertrude Horn, born Phantom. She was born in 1924. So as quite a young woman, she joined the so-called Mischlingsliga. And the name they choose is give us a hint to their background, because the big part of them came from the so-called non-Aryan parts of population at that time. And all the 3 women who've been portraying have been active in the communist resistance context. This focusing is justified because you could say in terms of Austria that the resistance against the NS regime between 1938 and 45 was mainly led by communist movements, and they were all active. Helga was already giving some hints in that context, and what the 3 women also have in common is that they all were deported to the female concentration camp of Ravensbrück, and all the 3 have been survived. The networks they've been active in been quite homogeneous, and the members had a friendly relationship usually, so the access, the contact with the resistance group was usually through private contacts of friends or family members. And have been homogeneous also in the sense because they had similar discrimination experiences So that explains that the members of these networks were all together young people younger than 25 years old, which had to do with the fact that most of the adults had been or in the army or arrested or deported. And so from these youth groups, they still were kept all the time in movement, let's say, and with a lot of fluctuation because the situation was as such. Different between the groups is the social milieu they come from, whereas the members of the KJV and the Czech group, Trüxak was active, rather came from the workers' background, but the so-called Mischlingsliga rather was composed by young people from the lower middle class bourgeois context. The communist character also had an influence on the structure of the networks. As far as we were able to reconstruct them, they've been relatively hierarchic in their structure, and only the leaders were quite a big group, where just some of the members were informed about the clear political orientation. They all refused, all the three protagonists, to surrender themselves to stereotype gender types. They were in the organized resistance movement, were they active. That means they were not limited to humanitarian resistance or only to auxiliary activities to men, as Helga said, but they actively participated in the distribution of leaflets, etc., and really put their life at risk. And they had important positions, especially Barbara Eigensteiner had a leading position within her network. And the activities of the three women and their impact, they are just pass pro toto for many activities of many other women. There were other women in resistance who are barely known. I hand over to Simon. Thank you. I want to speak shortly about the conclusions we found about the political resistance of women and from general research in Austria. And in general, we could say about the resistance in general in Austria during National Socialism, basically 2,000 resistance fighters had been condemned to death. Still, the resistance has to be characterized as marginal. The reasons, therefore, is that Austria just surrendered to this German activities, and the high percentage also of people who were actually in favor of these events. There was resistance has to be understood that criteria of efficiency are not really to be applied for resistance. What we can say then, the resistance in Austria had a high political profile, which has to do with the fact, on one hand, that resistance fighters after 1945 had a decisive role in the reconstruction of Austria. And on the other hand, we have to say that the Allied forces already claimed a proper Austrian contribution to their liberation, and therefore the resistance fighters after 1945 for the Austrian independence have been instrumentalized in a certain way. The climate changed rather quickly, as Austria was mainly marked by those who came back from war and National Socialists. They had little understanding about the resistance fighters, and it was rather about defamation of them. So also the role of the mainstream political parties contributed to the so-called double speak at that time. And in terms of the role of women in particular, we could state that they were a rather minority and therefore underrepresented. And there was the Kreis 7 KGB a clear exception. With a closer look within the networks themselves, we see there's a relative equality between the genders, and resistance fighters had really decisive roles and activities at certain contexts and points. As it was said already, we cannot come to the conclusion that women were less political in their orientation, but it is rather a question of visibility. And in this context, we could hint also to the classical masculine characteristics of resistance structures. And in terms of the three networks we talked about, they all belong to the left wing. And this is due to the fact that there was a strong workers' movement in Austria, which was rather social democratic in its orientation initially, but from the beginning of National Socialism on, there was a clearer tendency to the communist orientation, which you can see through the more active resistance concept of the latter. So for Austria in general, we can say that half of all the condemned resistance fighters in Austria belong to the communist side. And this has to be limited, or that there was no general line which was clearly defined. The activists rather had a rather heterogeneous structure, and what connected them was their opposition against National Socialism.
But nevertheless, we've already heard about that the communist orientation has already been part and obvious in the structures of the resistance networks. And our study also dealt with the consequences at a micro level, with the consequences of what happened. And I would like to hand over to Helga, because she is an expert in the field of women in the post-war Austrian society. So the contribution of the women to the democratization of Austria is obvious, but not as obvious as we know, because it hasn't been perceived in society. So people say that women haven't really played a big role in resistance, but they did. And we try to trace the biographies of these three women, and all of them have been politically active after 1945. And thanks to our study, we know that this is the case, and that this hasn't been this is not only the case for these three women. They have been active in high political positions, or not in, let's say, as important or very important positions, but nevertheless, they have been active in the Communist Party of Austria, and then afterwards in the concentration camp as association. So we think that regarding their action or their active part they played as witnesses, they made big contributions. So the women in Ravensbrück, they have been active, or we have published in July 1945. There has been a brochure, a flyer, information flyer, published on the political activities of the women who have been imprisoned in Ravensbrück. And it's still, there are still these kind of brochures available. And these women gave interviews, they published books, they wrote books regarding their resistance activities, and I think this is a very important part. So there have been numerous women who went to schools and educational facilities in order to act as witnesses of this time. And they has also played their part in the democratization of Austria, in educating and raising their own children. And all the descendants, all the children of these women said that the values of solidarity and equality of human beings are important. And I think Brigitte will come back to this topic. So we've had a closer look at the children of these three protagonists, of our three women, and we've asked the second generation and third generation, and women and men who are descendants who have children of resistance fighters. And they have, let's say, their childhood was a bit different compared to the rest of Austria. Especially, well, it wasn't obvious when they were small children or younger children, but when they went to school, because they were children of communists, and there were only very few children of communists in their class in school, and some of them have been named and shamed as Jewish children. And this, let's say, Jewishness or being Jewish didn't play a crucial role in their family. So, the resistance fighters' children knew what happened in school. And there have been different summer camps, for example, where they went to, organized by communist friends, or they went to gatherings or events. So what is typical for this kind of group is that they haven't only been active, or let's say that they didn't only appreciate their family, but that they are also highly dependent, or that they like their peer family or peer group. So they talked about what happened, maybe not at home because the parents didn't talk about it, but in these groups, so with their peers and in other families, for example, the parents talked about it very much. There are different experiences made. Some parents talked about the experience they made during the Second World War, and the others didn't. So there have been fragmented narrations at home. Or some of the interviewees said that years, 10, 20 years, when they were grown-ups, they started understanding what happened. So we've asked these children regarding traumas or trauma in general, and they stated, or the majority stated, that their parents suffered from traumas, but they didn't, they themselves. So due to the biographies of their parents, they have been nevertheless suffered a bit, or it was conceived, or it is conceived as a burden. For example, some of them went to therapy, others didn't. So they've also stated that they always had the feeling to be part of a marginalized, of a fringe group in terms of politics or the political opinion. And our interviewees had a very special or a very specific image of themselves being influenced by the fact that their mother or their mothers have been active in resistance. And that what was interesting is that being a woman was or is associated with being strong and being also active in resistance. But nevertheless, these former resistance fighters, so the women, have been or have subordinated themselves or integrated themselves in the hierarchy of the families. And the members of the second generation said, I think, or that they think that their parents would do it again, would go back to resistance again if this were the case. So solidarity and political commitment and fighting, combating and advocating for the poorer or for the marginalized is part of their life. And this is very interesting. So all in all, we can state that the experience made in resistance and persecution of the women, of the mothers, created something in their children. So it influenced their children. And now that they're grown ups, they stated, or they said that they know what happened and that this changed something in them or touched them. So I hope you liked this little overview, and it would be very lovely to hear from you or to get your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. Me personally, I was very much impressed by the different topics and aspects that have been associated, that have been brought together in this one book, and centrally or essential have been or are the resistance networks and the role of the women and our three protagonists in this, or in these those kind of networks, and also what happened with these women in the post-war Austrian society. And what I would like, or what I think is very interesting regarding our events, upcoming events, is what happened after the liberation, what happened to the women, what happened with them, what have been their experiences they made, what is their understanding, their concept of democracy, and what is the impact on the children, and did they pass this knowledge or this idea on it. I think you've provided us with many interesting information. I think there are questions. I have two questions myself, and I would like to start with these questions. So first of all, regarding political activities of the survivors after 1945, I think we've already heard about it, that they advocated for specific topics at different levels and in different institutional forms or shapes. So regarding gender policy, they have been committed in terms of gender policy, and I think one can say that this has been of high importance for these women, or can we say this? And I'm very much interested in the following question. Are there any, or is there any way of remembering or of memory regarding women resistance, women who have been in resistance, active in resistance in Austria? Okay, I would like to start, and then Brigitte and Simon can maybe proceed afterwards. So the central values and the overall goal of the women, and also of the women who have been part of the camp community, were especially like our leading Beatrix, one of the leading women of the camp community, was democracy. Democracy played a crucial and essential role, and it has been an essential part of their work when it came to talking about what happened during the World War II, during dictatorship, and what it means to be deprived of rights, of democratic rights, or of the restriction of rights when the rights have been limited, and what this means for life. And I think there have been many different protagonists, different women who have been imprisoned in Ravensbrück, and they talked about this topic. And I think between 1957 and 68, there have been books published, interviews published, and in the context of the Communist Party, many things, or let's say there have been many activities within the Communist Party. And later, it hasn't been as much focused or oriented towards political parties, but nevertheless, democracy has been key or was key. Maybe Brigitte, you would like to continue? Yes, I would like to refer to the second question. So women in resistance and how we remember them in Austria today. Nowadays, we have been active for years, and I think the way of remembering these people and these events, remembering resistance, so the number of events has been increased, because after the Waldheim debate that took place in Austria, we kind of distanced, or we got away from this kind of thesis of this victim focus, because we wanted to change the focus. And so what we try to shed light on is not only the victims, but also the victims or the people who have been active in resistance. And what was interesting is that many men in resistance died, and this is why the women became more apparent or more obvious, maybe. And it became more obviously that they are part of resistance, that they were resistance. And I think this is why the debate changed a bit towards this a more female perspective. And together with our colleagues, we try to organize events on female resistance, for example. And we also try to, what is interesting is that the children of these women publish books, and I think of the book of Ruth Steiner, for example, and other children in other contexts. So it's not only about this one topic, but also in other federal states in Austria, there have been resistance fighters in Goldeck or the partisans in Steiermark or other federal countries, federal Länder in Austria. So resistance of women or female resistance is part of our world today and of the debate, but I think we could definitely increase the debate.
Let me maybe add the role of the women in the resistance. For those who came to Ravensbrück later on, it was from the beginning was really a central thing to really publish the importance of the role of the women. Also, if you look into the statutes of the Austrian camp community, Ravensbrück, this is one of the important goals. They tried through the book and through exhibitions to really convey this. And as Brigitte said, it really came to the contents to the grand public just with the 80s and the beginning of the 90s of the 20th century. Maybe shortly, we've seen when they came back to Austria, on what kind of negative image they bumped into towards them when they came back to Austria. This post-Nazi period, let's say, where the traumata were not taken seriously, and they were basically dealt with, that they thought these traumata couldn't last longer than 6 months, and this shows a bit how long it took until it really got its space in the collective memory. I think it is really impressive. That doesn't only refer to the Austrian camp community, but general Ravensbrück survivors, how they really marked the memory and were active in the narrative about Ravensbrück. There's one question in the chat, and I just wanted to explain again how the chat works. If you're watching us through YouTube, then next to the video, there is the chat function where you can enter a question if you're registered on YouTube. Otherwise, on the top of the chat, there's a link to the application Slido, and you could just go there and just post the question without any further registration. The question comes from my colleague Sabine Arendt from the Memorialsraum of Ravensbrück. And she is very grateful for your detailed contributions. And she was asking to elaborate a bit about how you define resilience and resistance, and or how the women defined it and what all belonged to this kind of concept. Maybe I could say something.
Verständnis zugrunde gelegt, was sich auch daher motiviert ist, sozusagen.
We departed from an understanding that on the background of this totalitarian background, even everyday activities have a resistance character, and also small forms of deviation were confronted with the harshest consequences. But the three networks we've been investigating were really classical political resistance. The activities of the networks were marked by really political activities in the proper sense. Well, the protagonists, they've been really in the organized political resistance as activists, but still we believe that a limitation of the concept of resistance as it happened during up till the 1970s, 1980s, from these organized military-like resistance structures was just too short. And as Simon already explained, this, especially on the background of dictatorship and totalitarian systems, any kind of opposition activity has to be defined as an act of resistance, because we also firmly believe that there's a closer definition, the more narrow definition of resistance was one of the reasons that the role of women in resistance wasn't perceived for such a long time, or even devaluated up to a certain point. And this can be seen in certain names as the so-called Mädelarbeit and these. So it's about how the resistance of the German-Austrian women in resistance activities in exile have not been perceived as such. I think this focus during a long time on the organized political resistance actually was a good strategy, in quotation marks, for the Austrian majority society, because therefore through this they didn't have to face themselves the questions of being co-perpetrators or not active against, and how the women saw themselves as resistance fighters. Many of them often said, well, we didn't do anything special. It was, this was just normal. We had to do that. That was often their attitude. So they didn't consider their activities as something special or extraordinary. And there are certain interviews which we found where the women which were active in organized resistance networks, that they didn't even mention these activities. We just had to find that through other sources, or in the interviews, the resistance activity just takes a small part. Maybe I could highlight another aspect. We were dealing a lot in detail with the history of the Austrian camp community and with the question, what was the resistance actually consisting of, and what did the women consider as resistance? And we could say that it was always quite ambivalent. As Helga said, often they keep really low profile and say, oh, there wasn't anything special we've been doing. But on the same time, if you have a look on what kind of acts of resistance they remember, for as the camp community, still the organized resistance is in the foreground, and this image was still very important to them.
Kann man sagen, dass wenn es Ravensbrück gegangen ist,
and at the same time, we could say when it was about Ravensbrück and their time in deportation here, that they, of course, say that each act which was not conform to what was required by the SS has to be considered as acts of resistance. So in retrospective to that time in the camp, they had a very broad understanding of resistance. But in their political activities, in the closer sense, they rather would focus on the organized and very dangerous resistance activities, and not so much on all these many small individual acts which women also committed from a political understanding. So this has many different facets of this understanding of resistance as such from the side of the women themselves. That's very interesting. It's even a bit paradox in a way, what was considered to be acts of resistance according to certain conditions or situations. I have another question which was asked in English. I'll read it out in English, and someone is asking, what was the reaction or backlash to women being resistance fighters and being so prominent in post-war Austria?
Widerstandskämpferinnen im Nachkriegsösterreich dann auch eine gewisse Prominenz hatten, wobei die hatten sie ja erst später, ne, ab einem bestimmten Zeitpunkt. Aber gibt es dann zu diesen Frauen in der Öffentlichkeit auch, gibt es da negative Reaktionen oder was sind die?
So have there been negative reactions against these women in the public sphere? Let me start, maybe. Well, in general, those who came back from the camps have been confronted with the reaction that the sufferings they had gone through wasn't perceived. Many women we've been interviewing told us when they simply just mentioned that they had been deported to a concentration camp, or if they tried to speak out, that they usually heard, oh yeah, we also were hungry here, and we also had a hard life here, and this was often the first reaction. So yesterday there was the presentation of the book of Veronika Duma about Rosa Jochmann, who was one of the most prominent resistance fighters in Austria, or at least has been perceived as such. Or as Veronika Duma yesterday said, she didn't really make public these parts of her biography in the public sphere, and also in their work in the context of political parties. Their persecution experience and resistance experience didn't play such a role before, at least before her retirement.
So it became much more obvious when she retired or during her retirement. Excuse me, I would like to proceed. So at the same time, one has to say that due to the role Simon just talked about, that the Austrian state did so, talking about the resistance fighters, that they have been instrumentalized, they have been used by the Austrian state in order to keep to preserve their sovereignty. They have been used, and they have been used for the liberation of the Austrian state, so the Austrian state that have been liberated from Hitler. But they haven't received any appreciation, and they haven't been honored. And this is, of course, a big problem in terms of this part of the history. And I think the impact or the consequence has been that they have been politically recognized in terms of National Socialism, but their suffering, their personal horrors, the atrocities they suffered from, they did not perceive, they haven't been perceived by the public and not by themselves. So regarding the, let's say, known resistance fighters, I would like to say the following, because I highlighted a few groups that have been part of resistance. And I think talking about these prominent figures is not the correct term. So Rosa Jochmann, for example, she is a very famous resistance fighter, and she has been very active in resistance, or Kette Leichterreich, for example, or other women. And there are official remembrance days and events in Austria during which some men and women have been honored and who have been remembered. But nevertheless, I think that we could do more, or that we need to put that into context, because we are experts in this field. It's our job to deal with those histories, and because we deal with this commitment, but nevertheless we live in a bubble, so to speak, and that we move in our own bubble, because we know these topics, we work on these topics. And I think in Austrian reality or society, this is not a let's say hot topic that is constantly discussed. I would like to support the hostility, because some of the female resistance fighters have experienced hostility in society, and they had the feeling to be surrounded by enemies, and that the people who have been who have been interned in concentration camps, people thought of them, oh, okay, I think they did something wrong because they have been imprisoned in concentration camps. So there must have been something that happened. So this is an interesting aspect, I think. Yes, thank you very much. I think we have 5 more questions we've received in the chat, and we have to be, or you have to be more brief, please. Short and sweet, ladies and gentlemen. So another question. A question regarding, or coming from Sabina Arendt, regarding the following, regarding the narrations, the narratives within the families. How did, so the resistance that had as a consequence, that led to the consequence of the imprisonment in the concentration camp, how did this lead to resistance in the camps? So how was the, let's say, how was it described within families and within this family narrative? So generally speaking, we stated that our interviewees, so the women and men of the second generation, that when they talked about what happened at home, or what they what they got to know at home, so the information they received at home, that the resistance has been or was definitely a topic within the family, and in other families it hasn't been only fragmented or only talked about in a fragmented way in Austria and in these families. So it wasn't rather about the resistance within the concentration camps, because the parents, the former resistance fighters, did not talk about their time in the camps. So they talked about their experiences they made, and they passed this on to their children, but they haven't really been, or they didn't really talk about the time they spent in the concentration camps and their experiences. Thank you very much. Another question regarding the Austrian community, camp community, and could you please give us some information on the community camp community, and do you think that they so what is this kind of Austrian camp community, and when did it start? When did it start? So did they start this community during their time in the concentration camp or afterwards? So this camp community was founded in 1947, so 2 years after the war ended, and it has been a community of political resistance fighters, women who have been interned in Ravensbrück. And there are several Ravensbrück camp communities in different countries, and in Austria, as I've already said, this was founded or launched in 1947, and in the founding paper of 1947 there have been 58 members. No, it was in 1958 when they signed this, let's say, statute, but nevertheless it was founded in 1947, and there has been a hint or some information on this mindset of the camp community, this idea of the solidarity in the camp, and this feeling of being connected, being that has been grounded on solidarity, is part of this community, of this mindset, because they shared the atrocities they suffered from, and this is why they felt kind of related to each other, and this is why they found each other and they came together in this camp community. So this memory of being persecuted, this memory of what they suffered, what they've experienced in the camp, and they have been active in different areas, so they supported each other, and this kind of let's say self-aid or peer aid, and so they try to help each other, to support each other. And another aspect has been to create, let's say, a community, because these women experienced problems outside of the camp, so they have been recognized. The people said, oh, you have been in a camp, okay, but it was also very bad in our world, and they experienced this kind of solidarity. We received a comment coming from Ruth Steidling. She said that the KPÖ haven't been, let's say, enthusiastic because the women came back to the Austrian society. But now I would like to ask another question regarding the second generation we've talked about. So the first question is, how did you perceive the interviews with the family members? Was it easy? Was it okay to talk about their childhood memories? And the second question regarding this topic was, is there a difference between the sons or daughters interviewed regarding the role their mothers played and the values they've shared with them? Was there a difference between sons and daughters? So we have been active in the Austrian camp community for years. This is why it was quite easy to access the children, because we know them and we know the children of the survivors. So what we did is we conducted 4 or 5 interviews with descendants of our 3 protagonists, but we've also talked with other members of the second generation. And we also organized a group discussion. And I think what we can state is that it worked out quite well, and that we created a very open-minded climate, I would say, or situation for them. And the members of the second generation know that we have been in good contact with their mothers. For example, one of the protagonists, after she came back from Ravensbrück, she died very early, but nevertheless, we have been active in this camp community, so we know the women. And I think this is why we had a good exchange, a great exchange with the descendants, with the children, and we had the opportunity to talk about many different aspects, like secondary traumatization or traumas in general. And what we wanted to know was whether the children had the impression that their parents have been traumatized or that they suffered from traumas. And our interviewees said that, or they talked about their own perception and their own impact, or that they felt kind of influenced by their parents and that they felt some kind of burden or stress, or yeah. But so I think it was a very open-minded exchange indeed. Helga, what do you think? Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. So we've met one son, we haven't met him before. And it was a very interesting exchange, a very positive relationship kind of. And the Memorial Ravensbrück had from Berta Gauscher, for example, Lauscher, they received a little violin from her heritage, etc. So many things have been very positive, and it was a great cooperation and a good collaboration. And I think the different comments, the different exchange have been of importance. And it's, of course, what is also important for the children is to remember to think about what happened, think about these women. And in the House of Austria, there is for example, a little exhibition on Ravensbrück where you can find artifacts of Berta Lauscher, for example, who was imprisoned in Ravensbrück. And this was a consequence of these interviews. So there is something physical created. And another question regarding the different perception of the sons and daughters. Maybe you can remember this question. So is there, or has there been a difference between the answers or the perception of the role of their mothers? So the perception of the male and the female descendants. So our group was very small. It was a little group, very few people, and we also organized a group discussion. We had 5, maybe 6, yeah, I think 5 women and 3 men we've interviewed. I don't know whether I'm right. You can correct me, Simon, when I'm wrong. So regarding the first question, I think no, there haven't really been big differences. Of course, what was obvious or apparent is that some of the interview partners had a dad, or their father was also active in resistance. So both parents have been active in resistance. So they had this kind of radar. So their parents have been active in resistance, but nevertheless, the activities of the father have been more paramount, so to speak, in their memory. But principally speaking, in general speaking, I think there aren't really differences between men and women. There haven't been any differences. What about you, Brigitte? What do you think?
Well, I'd like to mention a slight difference, maybe. I do think I had the impression that the women had rather more differences in coping with their mother and dealing with their mother during their growing up period in the intergenerational context. Men apparently was talking less about problems and conflicts than the women, I'd say. I'm thinking of two cases where conflicts were mentioned and which were put into the context with the traumatization of their mothers in the concentration camp, which does not mean that the sons might also have a critical view on the past of their mothers, but there was a bit more understanding than in other cases for other women, maybe. But it's you can't really give a general answer in terms of the two genders, but I perceive the slight difference, though.
Entschuldigung, bei mir war ganz kurz das Internet weg.
Sorry, I had a short internet connection problem. I hope I'm back.
Ich habe zwei letzte Fragen. Dann müssen wir auch schon
Two last questions, then we have to come to an end already. I'd summarize them because they connect quite good to each other. Okay, I think I'm stuck.
Entschuldigung, war ich weg oder war ich eingefroren? Ja, ne?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I was frozen for a moment. I hope we'll come to a good end here. Two last questions which I want to summarize because both actually refer to the relationship between different groups within the camp. One question is, it's more a comment maybe, that women in active resistance in the concentration camp in Amesberger rather formed a minority, and conflicts. Was there a reflection about the relation with other inmates who were less political? And then Ingmar asked up to which point the cooperation, they could say cooperation of the organized resistance fighters from Austria with other organized resistance fighters from other countries, and during the camp and before and after. Let me start with the last question. The international character of the resistance. Out of our protagonists or their networks, there have been trans-border activities, so to say, like informations or people or material had been smuggled over the borders. And on the camp itself, there was indeed an international resistance group which was co-founded by an Austrian, Meda Ernster, from 1943, 1944 on, where she stated that there was an international group of resistance within the camp in Ravensbrück. But before, Rosa Jochmann also tried internationally, in quotation marks maybe, to organize resistance inside the camp and also in her function as the bloc elderly of the political bloc. And they tried to act consciously as resistance and to build up a network within the camp. And the political deportees within the camp, like really the active ones, not only those who wore the red triangle, have certainly been in minority. But the many interviews we carried out with Ravensbrück survivors, and as what you can see in literature in general, within the camp, there had been similar attitudes and values towards other victim groups, like the so-called as-socials. Also in the narratives after liberation, they are presented with negative connotations or against the so-called criminals. So the camp inmates brought their own scales of values and prejudices, etc., along also in the camp, and it was even reflected in the memory of the camp afterwards. Maybe shortly also regarding the international aspect, Matrixak reports in attempts to build up contacts on international scale to monitor behavior of the Wehrmacht, and about the proportion of women in the active resistance activities, and their perception has to do really with the traditional masculine schemes of perception, and this was also defining who was considered to be a resistant subject or person, and also within the networks, this had an impact. Excellent, thank you. I think this kind of differentiated analysis is so important to understand who is considered by whom as whom or what. We presented the questions of our audience. We're a bit over time, so I really want to thank you for this book presentation. I hope this book finds a lot of interested readers. And Ms. Amesberger and Ms. Halbmayr, they will be online tomorrow again. They will present a book about the so-called as-social deportees, which was already mentioned. So for the three of you, thank you so much. Thanks to the audience, to the interpreters, to the technical staff. I wish you all a nice evening. And I hope you will be interested also in further events during these days of the commemoration of the liberation. Thank you.